Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. In a major win for Republicans, the North Carolina Supreme Court issued opinions in a series of very important cases involving voter rights. They could have major ramifications on future elections in the state. They could even affect the balance of power in the U.S. Congress. WRAL state government reporter Travis Fain has been covering the cases, and he joins us now. Travis, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, very quickly, just break down these cases and, more importantly, explain the upshot.
So the biggest one is about gerrymandering. We've been back and forth in this country about how much partisan gerrymandering is allowed. Like how, when you draw districts for congressional seats or for legislative seats, how much can you draw them in order to try to elect Republicans or to try to elect Democrats? Because that's how a majority gets and keeps power, right? Is they draw the maps. They're in charge of drawing the maps, so they draw them so that they and their friends are going to win and keep power. So this lawsuit has been about whether or not the state constitution, the Constitution of the state of North Carolina, limits gerrymandering, or if the legislature can just do what it wants. And basically what the Supreme Court said, the state Supreme Court has said here is, no, they can do what they want. Judges can't stop them. Another case is voter ID. We've been back and forth about that at least a decade. Basically, this round of lawsuits over voter ID said the law that North Carolina passed, which was part of a 2018 constitutional amendment, voters chose to amend the state constitution to generally require photo ID at the polls. The lawsuit said, hey, it's racist. Black people are less likely to have photo ID. Republican lawmakers passed this law specifically to suppress minority votes, and you can't do that. It's discriminatory. And originally, the courts had said, yeah, that's a good argument. But now this is the Supreme Court saying no. The final case deals with felons or former felons once they get out of prison, when they should be allowed to vote. The state's practice has been you have to finish probation, you have to finish parole, you have to pay off any fines that you owe before you can register and vote again. The lawsuit said, no, you should move that line. It should be as soon as they get out of prison, as soon as they finish that, that active sentence, they should be allowed to vote. And the Supreme Court has said no here, which affects, I think, something like potentially 56,000 people. But I don't know how many of those people had actually registered to vote.
So they reheard two of these cases, which is a very rare move for a Supreme Court. Usually once they make a decision on a case, that stands. So while it's sort of an extraordinary move for these two, it maybe wasn't so surprising to some, right?
Yeah, that's right. The two are the voter ID case and the gerrymandering case. Those were heard and decided last year by the state Supreme Court in the opposite way. I mean, the gerrymandering was struck down and said to be unconstitutional. The voter ID law was said to be unconstitutional. But back then, when that decision came down, Democrats held a majority of the seats on the state Supreme Court. We elect our Supreme Court here in North Carolina. In November of last year, of 2022, voters elected a 5-2 Republican majority on the state Supreme Court. So early on in this year, the Republican majority said, you know what? The Democrats were way off on these decisions. They're bad decisions. It's a redo. And they reheard the case. And that's two of the opinions that came down. And it really is unusual, just exceedingly rare for this to happen. And what Democrats will say is, well, they have destroyed norms of the court. And what Republicans say is, no, y'all are the ones that messed this up, and we had to go back and redo it. And we're trying to roll back some of this judicial activism that Democrats had been engaging in.
So Republicans are probably elated by these decisions, and Democrats, I'm guessing, are fuming. What are they saying?
Yeah, that's about right. Republicans are just saying this marks the end of judicial activism in North Carolina. Finally, we have a Supreme Court that just reads the law and does what it says and lets the General Assembly write the law. Because one of the big issues for gerrymandering was this idea that, no, the state constitution says the state legislature handles redistricting. It doesn't say, and then the court can step in and redraw the maps, as has happened in the past if they think they're unfair. Democrats, particularly on the gerrymandering issue, they will tell you that this is a huge blow for democracy. I mean, obviously, the core idea of gerrymandering is that the politicians pick their voters instead of the voters picking the politicians. You'll hear that said a lot. And in a lot of ways, it's true because, I mean, you have these very advanced computer programs where you put a lot of voter data into them and say, okay, draw me a district with X% of people who voted Republican in the most recent election and Y% who voted Democrats. The computer just bangs that out all across the state. And it's not easy, but you can really kind of almost guarantee some pretty solid results for your party. And that has been kind of a technological advance in the last couple of decades.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dive deeper into these cases. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporter Travis Fain about the state Supreme Court's recent opinions on major voting rights cases. Travis, Harper v. Hall, that's the redistricting case. It's also before the U.S. Supreme Court. What's the status of that now that the ruling at the state level has changed?
So that's a really interesting question because we've had this state level case playing out, and that's what the state Supreme Court decided Friday that we've been talking about. But Republican lawmakers had appealed it to the United States Supreme Court too, and that had a chance to have national implications on how much state courts around the country could try to rein in gerrymandering by their own legislatures. And with the decision that was appealed now no longer existing because they redid it, right? And they changed their mind here in North Carolina, the state Supreme Court did. So what is actually being appealed now at the United States Supreme Court? The bottom line is this decision could moot that U.S. Supreme Court process. The justices at the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, had asked recently for briefing from both sides to kind of say, all right, if this is what happens in North Carolina, because they're rehearing this, talk to us about what that means for this case. And I think one of the options is that the U.S. Supreme Court just doesn't deal with it anymore because it's not in controversy anymore because the person who appealed has now won.
And the Republicans are in control of the state legislature. They're going to be redrawing districts. What does that look like now?
So get ready to have more Republicans representing North Carolina in the United States Congress, and maybe enough to where right now it's a fairly narrow Republican majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. And that's all this affects because the United States Senate, that's a statewide vote. Put that in a different bucket. But Republicans control the U.S. House. It's close. Right now, North Carolina has 7 Democrats in the U.S. House. It has 7 Republicans in the U.S. House because of a court-drawn map that stemmed from this same case. That's going to get blown out of the water. Republicans are going to redraw it. You might be looking at 10-4. I mean, heck, you could be looking at 11-3, maybe 9-5. But, I mean, they now have a green light to draw maps that elect more Republicans, and that's what they're going to do in the coming months, and it'll have an impact on control of the U.S. Congress.
Now, with voter ID, that's Holmes v. Moore. What was the basis for arguing that the law was racist?
So basically, intent was the argument. And the lawsuit looked deep into North Carolina's history and it's not that hard to tick off racist things that politicians have done over the years to try to keep black people from voting. Everybody knows at least some of that history. And I promise you it is way longer and darker than you probably realize if you read these filings. And what the Democratic justices said is you have to take all that into account when you're trying to determine whether or not modern-day Republicans are passing this voter ID law with the intent to suppress the black vote. I mean, it just so happens that black voters tend to vote for Democrats. So partisan and racial gerrymandering or partisan and racial voter suppression kind of go hand in hand because of that outcome. But what the Republican justices said is you haven't proven this case. You have not shown that there is any black voter who could not vote because they didn't have photo ID. The law, North Carolina's law, is not that restrictive. The state will give you a free ID, for example, if you don't have one. If you ultimately can't get one, you could sign an affidavit at the polling place, the I am who I say I am, and you can vote that way. So there were these exceptions to this voter ID law. And so the whole question of the lawsuit was really, what was the intent of lawmakers when they wrote this? Were they trying to suppress the vote, or were they just honestly trying to secure the vote, as Republicans might say, by requiring voter ID at the polls?
So what happens now with that?
So voter ID is such a long history in North Carolina. This is one of 3 lawsuits that impacts voter ID, that targets this voter ID rule. The other 2 are going to have to run their course. Now, an injunction that was keeping the state from enforcing the voter ID law that, again, passed in 2018. It's in the state constitution. That is gone now because it was part of this case. We'll see if someone tries to get an injunction to block it in one of the other two cases. There's one in federal courts. There's a totally unrelated one in the state courts. So, I mean, we're not really done with this, but this is a big deal decision if you're following voter ID closely.
And then there's Community Success Initiatives v. More. That has to do with felon voters. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I mean, basically it's where is the line? When do you have your voting rights restored? Can you have them restored as soon as you get out of prison, essentially? Or do you have to finish probation and parole? And we've kind of gone back and forth with this. During the pandemic, there was one rule, and then the that's how lawsuits go, right? One judge decides something, and the next judge decides something else, and eventually the state Supreme Court decides it, which is what has happened here. And they've said, no, if the North Carolina General Assembly wants to, they can require you to wait until your probation and parole is done, which is what current law says. So they're saying that is not racist. It is not unconstitutional. You can do that. And I assume that's what we will continue to do in North Carolina. There will be a push, though, to change that law because, I mean, you don't just have to, you don't have to file a lawsuit. You can change a law, but you have to convince enough lawmakers to go along with that. That push will happen. I don't know how successful it will be.
So what happens next? These cases were presumably done when the Supreme Court ruled on them the first time under the previous court. Now the Republican court has ruled on them again. If the Democrats take control of the court, do they get reheard? Are we just going to be in this endless loop of opinions?
It's theoretically possible, but exceedingly unlikely. Republicans are going to continue to have this majority for quite some time. Supreme Court terms run a good while. They're staggered. So it would be years before Democrats would have any chance of taking back the court, and I don't think anybody sees that coming anytime soon.
Well, Travis, thank you for your reporting, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's WRAL state government reporter Travis Fain. For his coverage of these cases and how they'll affect North Carolina voters, visit the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.